Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Thomas Neal, a conductor, musicologist, and teacher based in Oxford. In 2018, he was appointed Director of Music at New College School, Oxford, one of the UK's leading preparatory schools and home of New College's renowned boy choristers. We discussed the life, training, posts, and compositions of Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, taking a look at the musical universe he inhabited in Rome, and yes, eventually getting around to tackling the current research surrounding the myth of his having saved Polyphony from the chopping block. Looking forward to the appearance of many of the composers discussed in today's episode, I encourage you to check out our summer graduate program here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, including the paid McGuinness Choral Fellowship to serve as a section leader in our yearly Choral Institute, scheduled next summer for July 19th through 23rd, 2027, here in Menlo Park, California at St. Patrick's Seminary. The fellowship is highly competitive, awarded to just 12 singers with a $1,000 stipend and up to $600 in travel allowance, along with free room and board for the week. Each day during the Choral Institute, we sing lauds, mass, and vespers using Gregorian chant, 2 motets daily, and 2 polyphonic masses throughout the week. Applications for the McGuinness Fellowship, as well as the summer graduate program, open in October. Stay tuned at our website for more details, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. And now, on to our interview. So, congratulations are in order because today your newest book was published. And so I wonder if you could start this episode by you just telling us what that book is and just briefly about yourself before we talk about our main topic, which is Palestrina.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. So the book that came out today is called Sicut in Cielo, Sacred Music in Early Modern Italy. And it was a collaboration with a dear friend of mine, Galliano Ciliberti. It came out of a conference on sacred music in Italy that we hosted online a couple of years ago. And we then selected out of that conference some of the papers that we felt would make a worthwhile book with new research into sacred music in all of its aspects, all of its features, from archival work and manuscripts through to performance practice to more sort of broader cultural questions. So we've been working away with all the authors for the last couple of years, and it finally came with a thud onto the doormat this morning, which was a very exciting moment. So yeah, that's part of my life. I have a sort of portfolio style career, I suppose you could say. My regular post is I'm the director of music at New College School in Oxford. That's the boys' chorister school, the choir school that's attached to New College. I think hopefully lots of listeners will have heard New College Choir. We've been around since 1379, and notwithstanding the Reformation and the Civil War and various other things, we're still getting very strong, and you can listen to our live stream services regularly. So when I'm not here teaching all of the boys, not just the choristers, but I teach all the boys instrumental studies, music theory, history, composition. We do the full works. When I'm not there, I'm often conducting choirs. I'm the organist at St. Michael's Church in Berkeley, which is a traditional Catholic parish, just a few miles south of here. I direct various choral societies and chamber choirs as well, often in the context of the liturgy. And just a few years ago, I founded my own group called Ensemble Res Sacra, which was designed to focus on low-pitch male voice polyphony in the liturgy specifically. So we sing in various churches in Oxford for the old rite of the Mass, for the traditional Latin rite, but trying to reintroduce those practices of performing at the low pitch, occasionally with ornamentation or occasionally with organ accompaniment, but putting it right back into the liturgy where it belongs. When I'm not doing all of that, I'm researching and writing, usually on the subject of Palestrina. I've become a professional bore about Palestrina, shall we say?
Great.
Yeah.
Well, that is our subject today. Is kind of wrapped into two of those subjects, and to start off, I would like to look at the musical training of Palestrina. So, what do we know about what he learned and received as a child to start such an auspicious career?
Yeah. Well, as far as we know, Palestrina had a fairly standard upbringing for a composer and singer of his time. Of course, we don't actually know exactly when he was born. We think probably 1525. That's why we had all those anniversary events last year, or 1526. But even that date isn't really
maybe
precise.
what you're saying is I didn't miss the 500th anniversary with this episode.
Yeah, sadly, I didn't want to mention it, didn't I? So yeah, he was probably born in 1525 or 26. We know that because there was a chap called Melchior Mayor who penned a little obituary to him when he died in 1594, and he described him as having lived for 68 years. So we can kind of guess roughly when he was born. It's also possible that he was born on the 27th of December, the feast of St. John the Evangelist, because we know that his name is Giovanni and not Giovanni Battista. So his patron was St. John the Evangelist, as far as we know. We don't even know where he was born. I mean, it's sort of assumed that he was born in the city of Palestrina because that was the family name, and he was, throughout his career, the name of the city of Palestrina is always associated with him. But actually, we know his family occupied a property in central Rome, just near the Lateran Basilica. So it's quite possible that they moved between the two properties, or that perhaps he was actually born in Rome, or whatever. We don't really know. And actually, we didn't know much about his upbringing at all until just a few decades ago, which in Palestrina scholarship is very recent history, when his name appeared in the list of choruses at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. And his name appears on the 25th of October, 1537. So he's listed as one of the 6 pueri chorales, so singing boys. And he was under the care of a chap called Giacomo Coppola. So he was one of the chaplain singers who was responsible for not only educating the boys and singing with them, but also for clothing them and feeding them and literally giving them a bed for the night. So we think he might have been at Santa Maria Maggiore from about 1533, because the typical age of admission was around 6 to 8 years of age, so very similar to what we still do here at New College. Now, the music masters at the Basilica at that time we know were Rubino Malaper and Ferran Labelle. So two relatively minor figures, and we don't know an awful lot about them. But we do know that he must have been educated in several key skills that all choristers in Rome at that time possessed. So number one, he would have been taught how to sing the plain chant for the Mass and the office. That would have been his number one role. He would also have learned how to sing polyphony. And from what we know of the culture of the time, he probably sang works by figures such as Josquin de Pré, Mabrianus de Orto, Gaspar van Verbeek, and Philippe Verdelot. And in fact, some of those figures reappear in some of Palestrina's later works. He takes models by Josquin and Verdelot especially, and consciously models some of his music on their compositions. To a lesser extent, he might have sung a bit of music by Jacques Arcadelt. He did write some sacred music, although he was mostly a madrigalist. And the other big figure of the time was, of course, Costanzo Festa. There were also a lot of Spanish figures in Rome at that time for political and historical reasons. And so we know Morales' music probably would have featured quite heavily in his education as well. And again, there were parody masses composed by Palestrina where he took Morales' music as his model. So definitely singing, plain chant and polyphony. But there was so much more to it than that. We know that choristers of that period were trained in vocal improvisation over a plain chant cantus firmus. So they kind of improvised counterpoint that we know as cantare super librum, so literally singing over the book or off the book, if you like. So this is where one of the boys, or perhaps one of the singing chaplains, would have sung the chant Cantus Firmus, and then the other boy would have improvised a discount, literally a descant, as we would call it now, over the top, following a series of quite strict rules, all based on the rules of counterpoint. And we can imagine that that's something he almost certainly did. So through such performance practices and through other schooling methods, Palestrina would also have learned the basic skills of composition, probably using a wax tablet, as was often the way. And although no mention is made of it, he must have learnt the skills of an organist and a lutenist during this period, because he was appointed back in his hometown of Palestrina as the organist of the cathedral at quite a young age. And then later on in the 1570s, in some letters, he describes how when he's working out a composition, he plays it on the lute as he goes. So we know that he must have gained these skills at some point, probably while he was in that early part of his career. So while we don't have anything definite and concrete beyond his name in a list of choristers, we can kind of imagine, quite specifically, I think, the sorts of skills that he would have acquired and the sort of music that he would have known quite well.
Yes, this aspect of improvising cantare super librum. This is a class we're offering at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music this summer, July 27th through the 31st. And I think it's so important because what we can see in someone who does that, you inculcate the rules of counterpoint in a way that is totally superior to just studying it, working it through on the page, or even at a keyboard or a lute. I think the act of vocal improvisation is so interesting to shape one's sense of the vertical and horizontal aspects of music at a point. And I'm hoping that just in the same way that I think there's been a recovery of improvisatory traditions in other areas, in conservatories, I think there's something to be gained through this aspect of regaining control over lines and materials for vocalists that will reinvigorate practice in our own time even.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's some fascinating work being done at the moment by figures such as Peter Schubert and at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis and the group Palma Choralis in the north of Italy, doing some fascinating workshops into reconstructing these methods by which people learned how to sing, how to write counterpoint, how counterpoint was a feeling in the throat. It really was an instinct. It wasn't just about numbers and intervals and strict rules as such. It was really a lived art, if you like.
Yeah. So let's get back to Palestrina's biography here. And can you narrate for us his rise as the Maestro di Cappella of the Cappella Julia and then the Cappella Sistina, and then that rule enacted by Paul IV to restrict him from his position?
Sure. So Palestrina's first recorded position, the first time that we really get to see Palestrina as an individual, is in a contract dated the 28th of October, 1544, so just shy of his 20th birthday, we think, which indicates that a person of his name, answering his description, if you like, was engaged as the organist and at the cathedral in Palestrina. We know he was required to play the organ on feast days and to direct the choir at Mass, Vespers, and Compline. He was also expected to instruct the clergy in plain chant, or else undertake the musical education of some of the choristers. Then everything changed really on the 8th of February, 1550, because after an extended conclave, the Cardinal Giovanni Maria del Monte, who was then the Bishop of Palestrina, was elected Pope Julius III. And the new Pope's successor at Palestrina, Cardinal Borbone, named the composer Palestrina as organist and maestro di cappella back in his home city. There's been a lot of confusion over this in the literature. I think it's often been assumed that because Cardinal Del Monte was the Bishop of Palestrina, that he must have known the composer personally and then kind of automatically promoted him to the Capella Julia. Actually, I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding, because the bishopric of Palestrina is one of the suburban dioceses of Rome. He wasn't actually a standard diocesan bishop. It is perfectly possible that Cardinal Del Monte never set foot in Palestrina. As far as we know, he may never have met the composer. What's much more likely is there were other quite senior clerics, including one priest from Sant'Andrea della Valle, the big church in Rome, that had connections with Palestrina. I think it's much more likely that through the networks of patronage, this young, talented guy in his early 20s caught the attention of some senior clergy. And then when they were looking for a new post, it was only a short journey away. And I think it's more likely that simply a personal recommendation was made by someone lower down the chain of command than the Pope himself. Now, further documentation of his activities in that period is lacking, but in September 1551, Palestrina's name appears in the census books of St. Peter's Basilica. Now, we don't know why his name is there. He was paid 6 scudi, so for a fairly small amount of money. Possibly this was for copying some music or providing a copy of another piece. But then later in the same month, we hear that Pope Julius III has appointed him as Magister Cantorum of the Basilica of St. Peter. He receives a salary of 10 scudi each month, plus 4 more scudi for the maintenance of 2 choir boys. So just as he had been looked after by a singer in his time, so now he was looking after.
Perhaps that's where he really earned money.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some wonderful engravings of the old St. Peter's Basilica. Of course, this was at the time. This was before. Well, it was while the building works were ongoing. But there's this wonderful engraving that shows the actual house where the choir lived, and most likely where Palestrina himself lived too. Now, together with his work in the Capella Julia, Palestrina presumably participated in other freelance work in the city, and confraternity meetings, processions, and other such activities. There's a small number of works that we can date from this early period, mostly Magnificats and hymns, that we can date to around 1552. And indeed, from this point on, Rome was the city in which Palestrina both lived and worked until his death in 1594. And I think that's part of his appeal, is that he was at the heart of Christianity, at the very center of Christendom for his entire life. I think in one of the most defining moments of European history. I think had he moved around, perhaps he wouldn't have had the same image, the same appeal, or indeed made the same contacts that he did. Now, in 1554, Palestrina releases his first publication, his first book of masses, printed and dedicated to Pope Julius III. Now, this was really a landmark publication, not just for Palestrina, but actually for the printing industry and the whole culture of Italian music of the time. It was the first single publication of masses composed by a native Italian and published by a Roman printer. So it took until the 1550s for that to happen. Now, in the same year, Palestrina's madrigal Con Dolce Altiero appears in a Venetian anthology. And in fact, throughout this whole period, we see him really as a madrigalist. Tons and tons of madrigals appeared in lots of different anthologies, most of them published in Venice, but a few in Rome too. So after a few years, on the 13th of January, 1555, Palestrina was admitted to the Cappella Sistina at the command of his patron, Pope Julius III. Now, he made this appointment despite the fact that Palestrina was already married. Palestrina didn't have to undergo the usual examination that the other singers had to do. And indeed, the Pope didn't even ask for the consent of the other singers. So usually there was a public examination and then a vote. Now, it's likely that he was admitted because of his sort of previously demonstrated skill in composition, because as far as we know, he wasn't gifted with the best voice. We think he might have been a tenor. Now, the installation of a favoured musician by the Pope was not completely unknown. This was not an unprecedented act. Paul III had purportedly appointed Morales to the Capella Sistina without observing those regulations. And in neither instance is there any surviving record of resentment on the part of the singers. This was just part of the course. But things changed very quickly. Only 2 months later, on the 23rd of March, 1555, Pope Julius III died. And he was succeeded on the 9th of April by Cardinal Cervini, who took the name Marcellus II. However, as is well known, Marcellus's pontificate lasted only 3 weeks, and he died on the 30th of April, 55. The following month, a few weeks later, we have another pope, Giovanni Pietro Carafa, who was elected Pope Paul IV. Now, an important thing is that Paul IV was a reformer. He was loaded with the zeal of the Counter-Reformation spirit, and we see this affecting Palestrina quite directly, because on only the 30th of July of that year, so just a couple of months later, the Pope issues a decree forbidding the presence of married singers in the Capella Sistina. So Palestrina, along with 2 other singers, Leonardus Bono and Domenico Maria Ferrabosco, were dismissed from the Capella Sistina as that rule of celibacy was enforced. Now, they were treated pretty well. The 3 singers each received a pension of 5 ducats and 87 baiocchi. They remained in the mandati lists in a special category, eventually labeled coniugati. And basically, they received small pensions for life. So this was, I mean, tiny pensions, but still, it was not an unceremonial dismissal. Now, at some point in 1555, we don't quite know when, Palestrina published another really, really important book, the first book of madrigals. Now, on the title page, he's identified as Cantore nella Cappella di Nostro Signore, so a singer in the chapel of our Lord, in this case, our Lord the Pope. Now, the volume contains numerous tributes and references to the Colonna, that is the dynastic family of the city of Palestrina, not least 6 madrigals at the end of the volume that comprise what we call a sestina of madrigals on texts by Francesco Cristiani, which commemorated and lamented the brutal murder of Livia Colonna on the night of the 21st of January 1554 at the hands of her son-in-law, Pompeo Colonna. Now, the texts of Palestrina's Sestina were published in a huge collection of 161 poems compiled and edited by Cristiani himself, and printed at Rome by Antoine Barré in that same year. That volume was dedicated to Ippolito Secondeste, who later would become one of Palestrina's most important patrons. The volume is also important because it contains the text of one of Palestrina's later most famous madrigals, Vestiva I Colli. So that part of the story ends really on the 25th of September 1555, when Palestrina officially asks the Capella Sistina for permission to take up the post of Maestro di Capella at the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano.
Yeah. So can you now move us to understanding what his musical life looked like at the Lateran and the other basilicas he ended up going to after his
So he worked at 2 basilicas at this point in his life, 2 short bursts. First at the Lateran Basilica, and then a few years later he moved back to Santa Maria Maggiore, where his education had begun. So on the 1st of October 1555, we find that he's appointed as maestro at the Lateran Basilica. And this was the Pope's episcopal seat as the Bishop of Rome. And Palestrina remained there for 5 years until 1560. His salary is still quite small at this point. He has 6 scudi per month. He apparently succeeds his almost exact contemporary Orlando di Lassos. We're not quite sure on the exact dates of when Lassos left, There's some rumor that he might have left a year earlier and went traveling around England and Italy, but we're not quite sure about that. And he followed in actually a pretty grand and well-documented tradition of maestros di capella, with names such as Robin Malapert, Paolo Animuccia. His successors would include Annibale Zoilo, Francesco Roselli, Annibale Stabile. Some of these figures, although they're not very well known to us now, but they were regarded as the great musical men of the time, if you like. So in late July or possibly early August 1560, there's a record that says Palestrina has a disagreement with a chapter of the Lateran Basilica concerning his salary and the costs of instructing the boys. So yet again, we assume he was looking after the boys. He was feeding and clothing them as well as educating them. And then on the 3rd of August, he rather abruptly left the post, taking his son Rodolfo, who was also a choir boy, with him. There's a little bit of a hiatus there. We're not quite sure what Palestrina was doing or how he made his living between August 1560 and then the 1st of March 1561, when he entered employment at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. Now there, his salary is much better. He has 16 scudi per month, so a significant increase, which covered his musical duties and the upkeep of 4 choir boys this time. Now, we do have quite an interesting insight into what he was doing at the Basilica in this period, because unusually we have a manuscript, Santa Maria Maggiore 26, which was copied by the great papal scribe Ioannis Parvus, for the use of the choir of Santa Maria Maggiore, either in 1566 or 1567. And this is interesting because although it doesn't include any of Palestrina's music, it shows exactly the kind of repertoire that the choir was performing under his direction. So repertoire that he had chosen, that he personally had copied and then presumably used regularly. So the manuscript contains music by Costanzo Festa and Josquin. Now, interestingly, one of those pieces by Josquin is, I think, one of his best motets, Benedicta es Celorum, for 6 voices. And it's interesting because around this time, Palestrina composed a mass, one of his best masses, I think, and it's based on that motet. So we have there a nice little, 2 dots neatly joined together. There's also another manuscript, Santa Maria Maggiore 32, that Parvus copied at around the same time, and that comprises a big collection of Magnificat settings, also by Costanzo Festa. A further manuscript, Santa Maria Maggiore 36, also contains music by Festa, and again Morales, another big figure for Palestrina during this period. On the 18th of October 1566, we have this wonderful receipt, if you like, for Palestrina. It shows that he's been paid for providing music for the feast of Saint Luke in the church of Saint Luke, or also known as the church of Saint Cosmas and Damian, adjacent to Santa Maria Maggiore. If you go on holiday to Rome and look for this church, you won't find it because it was subsequently demolished. But this was a very important church for the confraternity, the society of painters in Rome, and it was attached to the basilica, and it was one of the duties of the maestro di capella to provide music with the choir from the basilica on the feast of Saint Luke. So we see that Palestrina was paid for that on the 18th of October 1566, but by the time the feast comes around again in 1567, it's a different name, featuring Giovanni Battista Montanara. So we guess that he must have left the post sometime in those 12 months. That's quite new as such, though. So we know comparatively little about the musical setup at the 2 basilicas during this period, but we can imagine they were rather similar. At its core, there was probably a small body of professional singers or chaplains who were responsible for singing the daily mass and the offices. The top line was provided by a small group of boy trebles, usually around 6 in number, who resided and were educated by the maestro or by another singer chaplain. On feast days or other special occasions, this core body of singers could be expanded with freelance singers. And in fact, we see Palestrina doing that later in his career, running in to direct a choir for a feast day or play the organ or as a singer, in fact. Now, the choir would often have sung with organ accompaniment, and perhaps on occasions the ensemble was also expanded with a small number of wind instruments. It can be difficult to date Palestrina's compositions to particular periods or years in his life, but it seems likely that Beatus Laurentius Orabat, one of his early motets, and another motet, Estote Fortes in Bello, together with three of his early Vespers hymns, probably date from that early period in the Latrin. There were also a substantial number of madrigals published in anthologies during the period. And based on what Palestrina went on to achieve in the years immediately following his tenure at the Latrin, I think we can reasonably assume that he was very, very busy composing, experimenting, and refining his craft. In fact, I think that his tenure at Santa Maria Maggiore was a really important part in his life. This is really when Palestrina became Palestrina. Some of his most famous works must have been composed during this period. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Missa Benedictus Celorum that I mentioned earlier, the Missa Utre Mi Fa Sol, and the Missa Illumina Oculos Meus, and most importantly, the Missa Bab Marcelli. They almost all date from this period. And in fact, some of those were then published in 1567 in his second book of Masses. So I think although it's difficult to pin these things down, I think it's a very strong argument for saying that his period at Santa Maria Maggiore really was the moment when he found his voice as a composer and really started doing things that no other composer was attempting, and no other composer had attempted up to that point.
Yeah. So you've been hinting around a couple of elements that I'd like to look at in the personal life of Palestrina. His marriage, his first marriage, and his children. It's interesting to think about him taking care of other choir boys while he himself is married and has children. And then jumping forward, obviously, quite a bit, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about his fortuitous second marriage, which was to a much wealthier person.
Yeah. So on the 12th of June, 1546, Palestrina married Lucrezia Gori, who was the daughter of the deceased Francesco de Goris. On 7th of November, the couple received a dowry of 130 florins from the estate of Lucrezia's father. And on the 16th of November that year, there was a division of property made, and Lucrezia received various household items from her family inheritance. Now, the composer and Lucrezia had a son, Rodolfo, who was born sometime either in 1549 or 1550. And I think it's likely he was named after Cardinal Rodolfo Pio da Carpi, who was one of Palestrina's most important patrons at this time, and in fact was the godfather of little Rodolfo. Now, Rodolfo comes to a rather tragic end, which I'll come to in a minute. But in the meantime, around 1551, Lucrezia and Palestrina have a second son, Angelo. Sadly, he also dies in 1571. Happily, in 1558, they have a third son, Eugenio. Now, Eugenio has a slightly happier, or at least a longer existence. He's achieved some notoriety in the literature because after his father's death in 1594, Eugenio became embroiled in a series of court cases with the Vatican Tribunal when he was bartering over manuscripts of unpublished works from his father, and indeed over the manuscripts of the chant revisions that would eventually become the Medicean edition of the Gradual, published in 1614. So a little bit of a shady figure in some respects later on, but certainly an important figure in Palestrina's life. Now, in 1566, Palestrina's eldest sons, Rodolfo and Angelo, entered the newly founded Seminario Romano as students. And they were there probably for about 5 years, and they would have received instruction in Latin, Greek, logic, philosophy. And this was probably as partial recompense for their father's services as Maestro di Cappella at the seminary. Now, we know a little bit more about them, actually. In September 1572, Palestrina published his second book of motets through the Scotto publishing house in Venice. Now, this volume is dedicated to the Duke Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, and a very important figure in Italy at the time, but a particularly important figure for Palestrina's life and career. Now, it contains works for the Mantuan liturgy, so for the Basilica of Santa Barbara, but it also contains music by Palestrina's sons. Rodolfo contributed a 5-voice motet, Confitevo tibi Domine. Angelo also contributed a 5-voice motet, Circuire, and there's even a motet by Palestrina's brother, Sila, who we don't know anything else about, really, a Domine Parte, also for 5 voices. Now, the Duke was obviously very pleased with this, and he sends a gift of 25 scudi back. Now, it's quite likely, I think, that Palestrina was advertising his son's skills in order to try and get them a position at court. There was obviously a good reason for this. Now, very sadly, only a few months later, on the 20th of November 1572, Palestrina's gifted son, Rodolfo, dies. We have only one other composition of his, which is a madrigal published in 1574. Now, much less well known than that volume of motets is the fact that Palestrina collaborated with his brother, Sila, and his 2 elder sons, Rodolfo and Angelo, in composing a mass. This is the Missa Dominicalis. Now, it wasn't published until 1592, long after both of his sons had passed away, sadly. But it almost certainly dates from the same period as the second book of motets, so from the early 1570s. And one of the giveaways is that the mass was edited by a Carmelite priest from Mantua, Giulio Pellino, and presumably it was based on a manuscript copy that Palestrina had sent to the Mantuan court, again in the early 1570s, and presumably before Rodolfo's death. Now, in 1573, Angelo Pierluigi marries Doralice Uberti, who was the niece of a neighbor of Palestrina's, Giacomo Uberti. And she brings a dowry of 1,000 scudi to be paid in installments. So Palestrina must have been very pleased about that. And he invested that dowry in property. We know he owned various properties around Rome, a vineyard back in the city of Palestrina. He was a fairly savvy gentleman, I think. On the 7th of November 1574, Angelo and Doralice have a daughter with beautiful name Aurelia. But sadly, the marital bliss is not to last, and only 1 year later, Angelo dies during an epidemic of influenza that killed about 10,000 people in Rome. The sort of slightly happier end to the story is that Doralice was apparently already pregnant with their next child when Angelo passed away, and so he had a posthumous son also named Angelo. Now, in 1577, Doralice remarries, and she requests the restitution of these dowry payments contracted for her first marriage to Palestrina's late son, Angelo. Now, this is where Palestrina has some liquidation difficulties, and in order to return the dowry, he has to put a mortgage on the ground floor of his main house in Rome. But nevertheless, everything was resolved, and the wedding took place on the 15th of August. Now, in November 78, Iginio, so the third son of Palestrina, married Virginia, and eventually they went on to have 10 children. Their first son, Tommaso Pierluigi, is baptized very soon after the wedding, and the godfather is Cardinal Guglielmo Cirletto, so one of the great artistic patrons of the time. In 1581, Aurelia and Angelo, so the composer's 2 grandchildren by Doralice Uberti and his late son Angelo, sadly also die within a short period of each other. This was only shortly after Lucrezia Gori, so Palestrina's wife, also dies very suddenly during a pandemic, and she was buried in what was called the Cappella Nova in St. Peter's, so it was still being constructed at the time. Now, what follows after that has often attracted a lot of criticism for Palestrina, because on the 13th of November, so just a few months really after his wife's death, Pope Gregory XIII received Palestrina's petition to be ordained to the priesthood. And indeed, on the 7th of December, he received the tonsure and the minor orders at the Church of San Silvestro al Quirinale, whose patron was his friend, Cardinal SE08. Only a few weeks later, 18th of January, he's even given a benefice at Santa Maria Maggiore. Now, the prebend carried no duties, but he did receive 24 scudi per annum as a pension. Now, the reason this episode has attracted criticism is that no sooner had he received the tonsure and the minor orders and this new position at the basilica, then we find bans of marriage being read out to Virginia Dormoli. And this marriage takes place on the 28th of March, 1581. Now, she was the widow of the papal fur merchant Giuliano Gurazzi, who had died in 1576 at the age of 36. Now, the marriage takes place in the Dormoli house rather than in a church by special permission, but actually this was quite common practice in the period. And the couple then settle in their own house on the Via Armelino. Now, the marriage is obviously advantageous for both parties, and it finally provides Palestrina with that ultimate financial stability. Virginia brought a dowry of 1,500 scudi, and henceforth the composer played a really central role in the management of the fur and wine business as well as in his composing activities. A few years later, Virginia even makes a new will, increasing the value of what she plans to leave Palestrina should she die first. In 1586, we see Palestrina taking a partner into the fur business as well. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that in the years immediately following this second marriage, we see a notable increase in the number of publications. It appears he devoted the remaining years of his life to creating a legacy of published liturgical music. So we see litanies appearing in 1582, motets in 1587, lamentations in 1588, hymns in 1589, magnificats in 1591, 2 volumes of motets for the offertory in 1593. And then all the while that this is going on, he releases his 5th book of masses in 1590, a 6th book in 1594, and a 7th book also in 1594. So these appeared in unusually quick succession. And if you chart on a timeline when all these publications appeared in his life, you can see this huge crescendo of publishing activities towards the end. So this is obviously very exciting for Palestrina. For us in 2026, this creates quite a problem for his biographers, because whilst it might reasonably be assumed that much of this music was composed some years, even decades before it was published, we actually have very little understanding of the chronology of Palestrina's works and their transmission prior to this publication.
So one of the interesting things to me underlying all of this is his spiritual life and connection to St. Philip Neri. So I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about that connection.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, actually, because while it's long been stated as fact, both by St. Philip's and Palestrina's biographers, as well as historians of the oratory, unfortunately, we have no concrete evidence of a link between St. Philip Neri and Palestrina, but there is quite a lot of circumstantial evidence. So in his Life of St. Philip Neri, published in 1879, Cardinal Capicolatro claimed that St. Philip appointed Palestrina as the Maestro di Cappella of the oratory in 1571. That's the same year that he took up his duties at the Cappella Julia. Now, the source of this information is not known, we do know that Giovanni Animuccia was maestro at the oratory until his death in 1571, and he was also the maestro at the Cappella Giulia at the same time. So perhaps the cardinal simply assumed that Palestrina took on both of Animuccia's roles at the same time. It's not unreasonable. The cardinal claimed that after he arrived in Rome, Palestrina endeared himself greatly to St. Philip's confessor, Persiano Rossa, and to another oratorian priest, Father Angelo Velli, and both of these priests were natives of Palestrina, of the city of Palestrina. Now, historians of the city, such as Petrini and Ciccone, have also been at pains to emphasize the connection between their composer and the famous Apostle of Rome. Petrini even goes as far as to suggest that Palestrina received spiritual direction from St. Philip. So this has a long history in the literature. All of this echoes the writings of the great Palestrina biographer Giuseppe Baini. Both he and Cardinal Capicolatro claimed that Palestrina composed, at St. Philip's request, a large number of motets and psalm settings, many of which they claimed were preserved in manuscript in the archives of the Chiesa Nuova, which is now the Biblioteca Vallicelliana. Now today, we can still find some of Palestrina's motets in that archive or in other sources that were once connected to the Chiesa Nuova, once connected to the oratory. Now these include quite a large number of polychoral pieces, so works for double choir. So there's the 8-voice Laudate Dominum, the 12-voice Beati Omnes, the 6-voice O Domine Jesu, the 12-voice Ad Te Levavi that was recorded for the first time by Clare College, Cambridge earlier this year, a 12-voice Salve Regina, and so forth. Now, we're told that he's set to music also for short pieces for 3 or 4 voices under St. Philip's direction. And these are a great number of popular canzoni, laude spirituale, and other hymns. Now, Palestrina certainly composed small-scale polyphonic canzoni, and a number of these were published in anthologies that were closely associated with the Chiesa Nuova. They were edited by figures such as Francesco Sotto di Langa and Simone Verrovio in 1586. So listeners may be familiar with some of these compositions. I think the most famous one is Jesu Rex Admirabilis for 3 voices, very beautiful work. There's also some evidence that a pilgrimage was made by Palestrina to Perugia, either in 1577 or 1578, while he was a member of the Confraternity of Charity, which had close associations with the oratory. One of Palestrina's other biographers, Raffaele Casimiri, cited a document, sadly now lost, which claimed that Palestrina undertook work for St. Philip Neri and the oratory in 1576. We also have this wonderful receipt. The only bit of concrete evidence we have is a receipt in the hand of St. Philip, so it's actually a relic, in which he realizes he owes money to one of Palestrina's neighbors, and he charges Palestrina with the task of returning this money. And here's a little note in St. Philip's hand. I hereby authorize Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina to make this payment. But perhaps the most concrete evidence we have for a connection between the composer and the saint is the fact that one of the oratorian priests, Father Giovanni Francesco Bordini, was the confessor of Virginia Domoli, his second wife. We might also note that among Palestrina's patrons and dedicatees, we find 2 noble patrons and protectors of the oratory, so Giacomo Boncompagni and Cristina di Lorena, who was the wife of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando de' Medici. But sadly, beyond these few basic facts, we don't know much, really. We can put all these pieces together and get something resembling a jigsaw. I think for certain they knew each other. I think it's highly likely that Palestrina did undertake work at the oratory and that he did attend the oratory meetings. In what capacity, it's difficult to say. And sadly, as is often the case with the 16th century, we simply don't have a piece of writing that says, I wrote this for St. Philip on this date in this place. But I think it's certain that they knew each other, and very likely that Palestrina would have undertaken some kind of work.
Yeah. So in the background of this, of course, this is return to the Capella Julia. So can you tell us about what sorts of conditions changed to draw him back there?
Yeah, I mean, the main condition is a bit blunt, really. It's simply the death of Giovanni Animuccia on the 25th of March, 1571. Now, Animuccia is one of the great figures, one of the great unsung heroes of this century, I think, musically speaking. He achieved, through his comparatively short career, he achieved a lot of the musical innovations and the aesthetic innovations that we now would attribute to Palestrina. I may get shot down in flames for saying that, but we can see in what survives of his motets, in his hymns, in his masses, and especially in his madrigals, actually, a lot of those, the increased homophony, the increased attention to the text, that regular phrase structure, and that very, very gradual move away from the old modal system, gradually moving towards what we would now understand to be a more tonal approach. So a lot of these innovations we can see in Animuccia's music, and had he lived longer, heaven knows what he might have gone on to achieve. He must have known Palestrina intimately, because he was both Palestrina's successor at the Capella Julia and also his predecessor, because Palestrina comes back to the Capella Julia in April 1571 as the Maestro di Capella. Now, he's under the patronage there of the chapel's patron director, a very important and powerful man, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who was not only a major political figure, but also a great patron of the arts. Now, he's contracted here for 100 scudi per annum, so a huge increase on his earlier salary. Plus a further 12 scudi for the use of his house for the care of 4 choir boys. So even at his exalted status now, he's still looking after the kids. In that same year, Cardinal Farnese becomes the patron director of the Capella Julia. Now, in the intervening years, you asked how does he get there? What conditions took him back to the Capella Julia? And I think it's important to take a step back and just look at what else he'd been doing in that time since he left Santa Maria Maggiore. So in the intervening years, he'd worked in the household of Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, we mentioned earlier. Now, whether he ever worked in the famous gardens of Tivoli, we simply don't know. The details are currently sketchy, but it seems likely that Palestrina acted as a sort of maestro di concerti, composing and performing musical entertainments, what we would call chamber music, I suppose, after dinner music, which might include motets, but would certainly have included madrigals. There's been some recent research on the Cardinal's household and his musical entourage, but I don't think that's yet really clarified exactly what Palestrina was doing while he was there. This was basically a part-time job in any case, while he was also at the Roman seminary. But it's during this period, in 1565, that Palestrina is given the title Modulata Pontificus, so papal composer. And he receives regular payments for composing and copying music for the Capella Sistina, even though he was not one of the active singers. These payments continue for the rest of his life. Now, between 1566 and 1571, he served as Maestro di Capella for the then recently founded Seminario Romano, which, as we said earlier, maintained a small choir of boys. And he was the first musician to occupy that post. We know he taught Gregorian chant and the rudiments of singing to the seminary students, including his own 2 sons. But clearly Palestrina's star was in the ascendant during these years. In the same year that he published his monumental Second Book of Masses in 1567, that includes the Papa Marcelli, he was approached by agents of Emperor Maximilian II of Austria with an offer to become the maestro of the Imperial Chapel in Vienna. Palestrina obviously sensed an opportunity here, and I don't believe he ever had any intention of leaving Rome. But nevertheless, he made a counteroffer asking for a staggering sum of 400 scudi per annum, a truly staggering amount of money for a working musician. Now, for comparison, a few years later in 1600, the celebrity artist Caravaggio was paid 400 scudi for producing the paintings of the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul in Santa Maria del Popolo. So that's the kind of celebrity gig that Palestrina was reaching for. Now, this salary was obviously deemed unacceptable, and so in May 1568, Philippe de Monte, who'd actually been considered for the post originally, was appointed instead, and they hired him at a comparatively cheap 300 scudi. So when Palestrina was appointed, or really reappointed, to the Cappella Julia in 1571, he was a very different figure to the gifted young 26-year-old musician that he had been in 1551. In diplomatic correspondence from 1575, the agent of the Duke of Ferrara writes that Palestrina, quote, is now considered the very first musician in the world. During this year, Palestrina's salary was increased to 240 scudi per annum, possibly to prevent him transferring back to Santa Maria Maggiore. It's a bit like football teams, really. He also undertakes a large amount of freelance work on the side. So throughout the 1570s, he's in regular contact with the Duke of Mantua, and he composed a series of masses for the ducal basilica there. There exists receipts from 1579 for 100 scudi, together with a promise of 3 more masses. So he was a savvy worker. I think Palestrina knew his worth. In 1578, he receives another payment of 80 scudi, partially payments in kind, for musical services to the confraternity of the Most Holy Trinity of the Pilgrims. So we would know this as Santissima Trinita dei Pellegrini. Now that's the very same confraternity and church in Rome, which is now under the care of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. And in fact, Palestrina owned a house just round the corner. Now, following all his various family tragedies and his second marriage in 1581, Palestrina seems to have aged rather quickly. Sometime in 1584, the Company of Musicians of Rome, what we would call the Confraternity of Santa Cecilia, was founded under papal auspices for the purposes of fraternal association and for the performance of music, and probably for a little bit of job networking as well. And Palestrina became a member. Now, the confraternity was organized in 1584, officially founded a year later under the patronage of Gregory XIII. This is the forerunner of the Accademia di Santa Cecilia that still exists today. Now, listeners may be familiar with the 12-voice Missa Cantantibus Organis, which is a parody mass composed by various members of the company, and it's based on Palestrina's own motet. Now, in 1592, Palestrina received further adulation from his contemporaries. In his Pratica di Musica, Lodovico Zacconi cited passages from numerous masses by Palestrina, including Missa Virtute Magna, Missa ad Cene Magni Providi, both in the first book of Masses, and also one of his Missa L'Homme Armé settings. And he cited these as excellent studies in compositional problems of proportion and rhythm. So he's already being held up as a model even while he's still alive. In the same year, Palestrina received the dedication of an anthology of Vespers psalms for 5 voices, edited by Matteo Azola. And this contains works by Barcusi, Croce, Gastoldi, Constanzo Porta, and other such figures. So 13 colleagues and students of Palestrina's compiled the book, and it was introduced with a Latin dedication indicating the high esteem in which he was held by these composers. And in response, he published a beautiful motet for 8 voices, Vos amici mei estis, you are my friends if you do what I command you, in an anthology also from 1582. So to a certain extent, we can see how his reputation's developing all the time through the 1560s, 1570s into his appointment at the Capella Giulia. But then really it's almost that appointment that really sends his fortunes ascending, coupled with the financial stability brought about by his marriage and his various connections to confraternities and other churches around Rome.
Yes, certainly. I think a lot of musicians could learn something from financial management from Palestrina. Let's go to a central point in the current long-standing mythology surrounding Palestrina, and that is, of course, the origins and impact of the Pope Marcellus Mass and its relationship to the Council of Trent. Can you set the record straight for people who might still be laboring under the long myth of Palestrina?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to think of an early modern musical work that's more shrouded in myth and misrepresentation than the Missa Papa Marcelli. I mean, for centuries, this mass has been at the center of a legend in which Palestrina allegedly saved liturgical polyphony from proscription by composing a work that somehow reconciled the supposed demands of the Council of Trent with the sheer beauty of high Renaissance polyphony. Whether performed in churches or concert halls, studied in counterpoint classes, or cited in general music histories as a pivotal turning point in Western composition, the Missa Papa Marcelli has held an unrivaled position in the canon of sacred music. But the myths have crowded out the facts, and both the music and the historical circumstances of its creation, its dissemination, and then its reception are really urgently in need of reevaluation. Indeed, beyond passing references to its historical significance or its pedagogical usefulness, the Missa Papa Marcelli has actually received surprisingly little scholarly attention in recent decades. So the first thing to say is we need to separate Palestrina's Mass, the stimulus for its composition, the process of composition, its subsequent publication and republication, from the myths and the legends that grew around the work in the following centuries. There's still quite a lot of work to be done to understand just how the Missa Papa Marcelli came to occupy that legendary status it's long enjoyed since the early 17th century. And it's a topic I'm addressing in a forthcoming book. But if we return to the Mass itself, the facts are simple and they're few. On the 12th of October, 1555, just 3 days after his election, Pope Marcellus II and his private secretary, Angelo Mazzarelli, recorded in the diary that Marcellus had gathered the papal singers together and admonished them for singing the liturgy with quote, with properly modulated voices and in such a way that everything could be heard and understood. Now, it cannot be doubted that Palestrina was present at this event. This was following the ceremonies of Holy Week, when the repertoire of the Capella Sistina was particularly enshrined in tradition. Certain pieces of polyphony were always sung at the same point, certain sets of lamentations, and it seems likely, really, that the Pope was complaining not so much about the composition, but actually more about the manner in which the music was sung. So, as listeners will know, in this period it was very common for the singers to embellish the works with ornamentation, with improvisations, to elaborate the whole experience. So, to some extent, some of the polyphony, especially that employed in Holy Week in the Capella Sistina, was really just a bare skeleton around which the singers would compose these famous ornamentations. And of course, we all know about the Allegri Miserere, as a later example of this tradition, but it was already going on in 1555. Now, at the same time, the Council of Trent was in its final years. The council, of course, met between 1545, closing up in 1563. As listeners will know, it had multiple troubles about the location of the council, how often they should meet. It kept being disrupted, and they would disband and come back several years later for more. Now, music plays an astonishingly, vanishingly small part in the deliberations of the Council of Trent, and they only get round to talking about it in the 22nd session in 1562. And really, the entire attitude is summed up in just a couple of sentences. Their aim was to reform church music by prioritizing the intelligibility of the text, but most of all by banning, quote, impure music or profane music from liturgy. So Canon 10, written in 1562, specifically ordered that nothing profane should be intermingled with the words of the Mass. So it's important to think back to the traditions that they're talking about here. So there's a long, long tradition of using the L'Homme Armé melody, for example, tons of masses, even two by Palestrina himself, using these as musical subjects around which to compose a polyphonic structure for the Mass. Now, the argument seems to have been that these melodies were sufficiently well known that they became a distraction to those attending the liturgy. And in fact, the late 15th and early 16th centuries, witnessed something of a crescendo in criticisms of polyphony in the sacred liturgy. Polyphony's always had it bad. Polyphony's always been criticized, literally since its invention. But this definitely crescendoed towards the end of the 15th and early 16th century with the rise of humanism. These criticisms have been charted by numerous scholars, so I won't go into them in great detail. Some consider polyphony to be unfit for the liturgy, particularly in the Mass, because some composers would use secular models for their parody settings. It was also claimed that the words of the liturgy were frequently obscured by overly elaborate lines and complex textures. Now, these criticisms were not new. However, at no point were these concerns given serious consideration by the Council of Trent. Now, we don't actually know when the Missa Papa Marcelli was composed. Some biographers think it likely to have been composed immediately after Pope Marcellus's rejoinder to the Capella Sistina in 1555, but we simply don't know. The earliest surviving manuscript source is Capella Sistina 22, which is very securely dated to 1565, so that's a whole decade later. I think it's also important to point out, actually, that the Missa Papa Marcelli is far from unique. I recently spent some time researching into the other pieces that Palestrina composed in the 1560s, specifically the Mass settings transmitted in manuscripts from that period. So we've got the Missa Benedicta est Celorum, we've got the Missa Ut Re Mi Fa Sol, and the Missa Illumina Oculos Meus. Now, along with the Papa Marcelli, these masses, which are all for six voices, show remarkably similar approaches to structure, to texture, and to text setting. So I think it's likely that they were all composed at around the same time in the early 1560s, perhaps in response to the Council of Trent's final canon on sacred music, if I were feeling bold enough to suggest that. But it is important to note the broader musical context here. This was not a lightning moment. It didn't emerge ex nihilo. Now, in 1565, on the 28th of April, in the Capella Sistina diaries, we note that the singers of the Papal Chapel assembled in the home of Cardinal Vitelli to sing some masses and to test whether the words could be understood. Now, it's possible, but again, by no means certain, that the Papa Marcelli was among the pieces performed in that workshop. All we know is that in 1567, the Mass appears in Palestrina's second book of Masses, right at the end of the volume, a rather wonderful book dedicated to King Philip II of Spain. Now, this book is not reprinted again until 1598, so it doesn't see light of day again until after Palestrina's death. Then it's rapidly reprinted in 1599, again in 1600.
Could I interrupt with a question
Yeah.
here? Is the printing in this volume dedicated to Philip II perhaps part of the contribution to the mythology? particularly with Philip II's intervention in the Council of Trent regarding polyphony?
I think that's entirely likely. Yes, yeah. All these questions are still being unpacked, but I think certainly Palestrina nurtured this patronal relationship with Philip II, partly to get access to the Spanish market, which was enormous. Spain did not have many of its own printing presses in this period, and so they relied on the Italian book trade and the book trade from Antwerp and others to provide their music. And clearly, Palestrina is trying to tap into that by dedicating this and indeed another volume of music to Philip II. But I think you're right. Philip II's reputation as a defender of the faith, as a key figure in Tridentine Catholicism, if such a thing existed, is very much part of that myth-making, absolutely. There's also a question about whether Palestrina's connections through the Jesuit networks, through the Collegio Romano and other institutions might also have had a part to play in it. What is interesting is that apart from the fact it's not copied much or reprinted until after Palestrina's death, is that in the early 17th century, once the myth gets going, it's not actually the Papa Marcelli that people are interested in. It's not the original composition, what we understand to be the Papa Marcelli. The piece that gets copied and performed and republished and circulated countless times is actually a four-voice reduction of the original.
That's so interesting.
with a basso continuo part. So in fact, there were several versions. Yeah, there were several versions that were circulated. There was that shrunk version down to four voices with a continuo. There was another version which expanded the texture to 8 voices by Francesco Soriano. So he turned all those textural tennis match techniques that we see in the Gloria and the Credo, he turned those into literally a polychoral antiphony for 2 choirs.
Hilarious.
And it works fabulous. It's been recorded. It's absolutely wonderful. And then quite recently, it was rediscovered that there's a 12-voice version of the Papa Marcelli as well that was composed for the Chiesa Nuova. So again, possibly another connection back to St. Philip. We don't know for sure. But what is clear is that 4-voice version, which I've performed with my own group several times, it's a brilliant version. Actually, I heartily recommend it to any listeners who don't have the full 6 voices, the double tenors and double basses needed. If you've got your standard SATB choir, look up the version by Neri for 4 voices, and it works extremely well. It's been shortened not just vertically, but also horizontally. He's compacted the whole thing and distilled it into this quite homophonic, very simple kind of missa brevis.
It's kind of funny to think about Palestrina's own work having this Tridentine process applied to it in the same way.
Yeah. There was an aggiornamento even for Palestrina, definitely. So it's that version that gets circulated and gets known. So I think actually when these 17th century writers like Agostino Agazzari in 1607, for example, start to perpetuate the myth of this homophonic, simple music, that's pure music that saved polyphony from prohibition by the Council of Trent. It's not actually the original that they're talking about necessarily.
Great, that's so interesting. When you are thinking about the overall oeuvre of Palestrina, what are some of the lesser known gems that you particularly enjoy?
Well, I have to say it's the masses. Palestrina composed at least 104 masses. Probably more. There are some records of various settings that have gone missing. But it's really extraordinary how little these masses are known, how few of them are performed regularly, and almost never in their original context, still less with anything resembling Palestrina's intended performing forces. So for me, I've mentioned them already, but those middle period masses from Santa Maria Maggiore, I think, are the absolute gems. So the Missa Illumina Oculos Meos, and especially the Missa Benedicta es Ciolorum, which is actually his longest, most expansive canvas, if you like. There was some astonishing works from later in his career that have a very different aesthetic. And for me, the real undiscovered gem, still to be recorded, if I'm right, is the Missa Inter Domine Speravi for 6 voices. He wrote 2 with that name, but the 6-voice one which is based on a motet by Lupus Hellink. So again, a model from the 1530s, but he was probably wrote this mass much later in his career. It has these astonishing crystalline textures. The Christe, for example, is written for a trio of sopranos with only one alto underneath,
Wow.
and which is just astonishing. So he expands the texture in different ways throughout the piece, and we performed it at the Stour Early Music Festival some years ago in a concert, and the audience simply didn't believe it was by Palestrina. It's the most astonishing piece. But I think it's important to say Palestrina really is a composer of surprises. I think a bit like, we tend to pigeonhole them like Wagner and Bach, and Schumann, and we think, well, we know those composers, we know what they sound like. Actually, we don't. We don't know Palestrina half as well as we think we do. I mean, I love the chamber music-like intimacy of his early madrigals. I love the complexity of those 6- and 7-voice Agnus Dei movements from his mid-career masses, and the 7-voice Tuus Petrus motet. And who can fail to be stirred by some of those double choir psalm motets from the 1570s and 1580s? There really is a huge amount to explore in Palestrina's oeuvre, and beautiful though the Missa Brevis, Sicut Cervus, Super Flumina Babylonis undoubtedly are, these are only a tiny portion of what was a much larger, more varied, more challenging, and indeed more surprising oeuvre. But I think we don't just need to rediscover the forgotten corners of his output. I really think we need to think creatively about how we perform this music, because the current standards, approaches, and assumptions are actually quite far removed from his time. And sometimes the biggest surprises are performing a familiar piece like Sicut Cervus, but just with different performing voices and a different acoustic, with instruments, with adding that little bit of ornamentation or whatever. So yeah, he is a composer of surprises, if you let him.
So let's conclude with your experience both as a scholar and practitioner of Palestrina's music. And I'm wondering what some of the constants in the advice that you give to choirs singing his music are.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to say that just as there was no single Palestrina style in terms of his compositional voice, I mean, I hope that's come across today, that he's such a varied composer. But in the same way, there's no single Palestrina style for performing his music correctly. Quote unquote.
You mean it's not just the English style?
Definitely not. No, definitely not. I'll be getting mail. But I do have a few principles. Number one, we should always choose the repertoire for our choir carefully, but then find the correct pitch that is both comfortable for the singers and which makes musical sense. I think too often we choir directors make unreasonable demands on our singers by failing to make those correct choices before that first rehearsal. So Palestrina should almost never be performed at chiavette, we call it high pitch, because while this is unusually, it's usually comfortable for high sopranos, but it places unreasonable demands on the altos and especially for the tenors, while in turn it creates some real problems for blend, for balance, for tuning. So I think choir directors should consider the questions of transposition and pitch very, very carefully. I know that many choral tenors will say they don't like singing Palestrina because it's too high, that Palestrina didn't know how to write for tenors. It's not true. Palestrina knew exactly what he was doing, but he was writing for a choir that was pitched about a fourth down from what we expect. I mean, another principle I think is that his liturgical music does not often respond well to an overly dramatic or rhetorical approach. I usually direct my choirs to focus on the music, on the notes, on the pitches, on the rhythms, over and above the text. So we think about melodic phrasing, we think about carefully handling those dissonances, preparing for them properly, shaping the phrases with dynamics, a really neatly measured tempo that suits the building and the environment well. We don't think too much about the text. Very rarely are there sort of sudden or dramatic changes in Palestrina's liturgical music. He's not late bird. or mid-career Monteverdi. He's a very different artist. He's a different figure. He works in a different way. Thirdly, I think it's important I would say this as a musicologist, but I do think it's important that singers try to understand how the music works. And so I often point out some of the techniques on display. These can be simple canons or just basic imitation or other textual effects. That's not to say we should draw attention to those in performance, but I do think it's important that we have that insight to help us navigate our way through the piece. And finally, I'd encourage choir directors to explore alternatives to a cappella performance. While this was certainly one option available to Palestrina in his context at 16th century Rome, and as many will know, the Cappella Sistina never, historically, performed with instruments, even the organ. It was by no means the only option, and it certainly wasn't even the most popular option. The historical records show that many Roman churches employed a very small group of singers, sometimes even just a quartet of solo voices. But they also employed an organist, sometimes a trombonist or a cellist as well. I think we need to be a bit braver in exploring these options. With my group here in Oxford, the Ensemble Res Sacra, we perform Palestrina's music using just 4 or 5 male voices, either unaccompanied or with the organ doubling the voices or providing a basso seguente. At St. Michael's Church in Berkeley, where I'm the organist, we often employ a basso seguente part for polychoral music. So this is clearly what Palestrina and Victoria had in mind. And we can see that from the way that the bass voices are often cast in fifths and octaves. For a concert a few months ago here at New College, we even used the instruments of His Majesty's sackbuts and cornets with organ for a whole range of Palestrina's music, from his 4 and 5 voice Ave Maricela, the hymn for Our Lady, all the way up to the 8 voice Ave Regina Celorum. It really can work well. And whilst not every choir will have those kinds of resources to hand, simple organ accompaniment, doubling the voices, can work beautifully. And it can provide a different color, a different texture, a different propulsion to the music, I guess. Yeah. A bit like when you're accompanying chant, it changes the music. It doesn't just sit on top of it.
When you do that, what sorts of registration do you use?
Now that is a very loaded question. I take a very pragmatic approach, and I would say it depends on where the organ is. It depends on the ears of the singers, how well attuned they are to the organ if it's at their pitch, and it depends on the acoustic. Usually I will find that an 8-foot and a 4-foot on the manual is sufficient. With a larger choir, you need that 4-foot in order for it to come through the texture. With a smaller group, so with a solo quartet, for example, then a simple 8-foot is usually sufficient. We don't usually use pedals, although of course you can couple the manual down to the pedal to help the organist negotiate some of those larger intervals in between the tenor and the bass. But yes, by and large, 8 and 4-foot should be ample.
That's great. Thank you so much for giving us a masterful outlay of a magisterial composer. This has been truly wonderful to learn so much about him, but also to have that invigorate a love for his work and for performing him.
Lovely. Thanks, Jenny.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.